The first thing I saw that morning was not my coffee, not the sunrise over my backyard, not even my old silver pickup sitting where it had sat for years. It was a bright yellow wheel boot clamped around my front tire like someone had just declared war on my driveway. And the strangest part was, the truck wasn't parked on a public street. It wasn't blocking anyone, and it wasn't even on HOA property. It was sitting on land that belonged to me. My name was on the deed. My family had paid the taxes on it, and I had every right to park there. But somehow, a company I had never heard of decided they had the authority to lock my vehicle in place and demand money from me to get it back. I live outside a quiet town in northern Georgia, the kind of place where people wave when they pass you on the road, and everybody knows whose dog belongs to which house. My home sits on a 1-acre corner lot, a simple brick ranch house with a gravel turnaround area in front that has been part of my property since the early 1980s. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't some giant driveway with a gate and security cameras. It was just a practical piece of land that my parents had used, and later I continued using after I bought the house. There was even a small wooden marker near the edge of the gravel and a little copper plate showing the property number, something most people would never notice, but something I had always known was there. For years, I parked my Tacoma in that spot every single day. No complaints, no warnings, no letters, nothing. Then one humid Tuesday morning, everything changed. I walked outside expecting another normal day. The Georgia heat was already building. The cicadas were making that loud summer noise from the trees, and somewhere across the street, a sprinkler system was clicking away like it always did. I remember taking a few steps toward my truck and thinking something looked strange, but my brain didn't register it right away. Then I saw it, a yellow steel boot wrapped around my front wheel. At first, I honestly laughed. I thought maybe someone was playing a ridiculous prank. I walked closer, grabbed the metal, and immediately pulled my hand back because it was burning hot from sitting under the sun. Hanging from the windshield was a red notice that said, "Unauthorized parking, community enforcement action." Underneath it was an invoice demanding $275 for removal. I stood there for a few seconds just staring at it, trying to understand what kind of situation I had somehow walked into. I wasn't parked on the road. I wasn't parked on somebody else's property. I wasn't even inside the HOA's maintained area. I grabbed the paper and looked at the bottom. That was when my stomach dropped. The company responsible was Sentinel Shield Services, a private enforcement company contracted by the Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Now, I had heard plenty of stories about HOA disagreements. Everybody has. Somebody gets fined because their grass is too tall. Somebody gets a warning because their mailbox color isn't approved. Things like that. Annoying, sure, but usually small stuff. This felt different. This wasn't a letter. This wasn't a fine slipped into my mailbox. Somebody physically came onto my property, touched my vehicle, and immobilized it. That was a line I couldn't ignore. I called the number printed on the notice, expecting maybe somebody would apologize and tell me there had been a mistake. Instead, a man answered with the kind of voice that sounded like he had repeated the same sentence 1,000 times and stopped caring about the people hearing it. "Sentinel Shield Services, how can I help you?" I said. "There's a boot on my truck, and it's sitting on my private property. I need someone to remove it." He asked for the notice number. I gave it to him. There was a pause. Then he said, "You'll need to pay the release fee first." I thought I had misunderstood him. "Excuse me," I asked. "You're telling me I have to pay you to remove something you put on my truck without permission?" He didn't sound surprised. He just said, "Sir, this area falls under Pine Ridge Estates Enforcement Authority." I looked around at my gravel driveway, at my house, at the fence line I had maintained for years, and I almost laughed because the statement was so confident it was almost impressive. "No, it doesn't," I told him. "This is my property," he replied. "All property connected to Pine Ridge is subject to community rules." Then he hung up. That was the moment something changed in my mind. I wasn't angry because of the $275. Honestly, compared to the cost of owning a home, it wasn't even a huge amount of money. I was angry because someone had decided that confidence was the same thing as being right. They weren't asking me, they were telling me. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't about a truck boot anymore. It was about whether someone could simply walk onto private land, claim authority, and expect everyone to accept it. So instead of paying the fee, I went inside, opened the cabinet where I kept old property documents, and pulled out a folder that had been sitting there for years. I had no idea at the time that a piece of paper from 1984 was about to become the most important thing in this entire fight. I spread the documents across my kitchen table, grabbed my reading glasses, and started looking for the one thing I knew would settle everything: the property line. I spent the next few hours sitting at my kitchen table with old documents spread out in front of me, and I have to admit, there was a strange feeling that came over me. Part of me was still annoyed. Part of me was wondering if maybe I was overreacting. Because that's the thing about these situations. The person who gets pushed usually spends the first few moments asking themselves if they're the problem. I wasn't trying to start a war with my neighborhood. I wasn't looking for attention. I just wanted someone to explain why they thought they could lock my truck on my own land. But the more I looked through the records, the clearer it became. The answer wasn't hidden in some complicated legal language. It was right there in black and white. The property survey from 1984 showed the exact boundary lines, and the gravel turnaround where my truck had been parked was not part of Pine Ridge Estate's common area. It wasn't maintained by them. It wasn't owned by them. It wasn't controlled by them. It was mine. The HOA boundary ended several feet before the gravel pad began. They hadn't made a mistake about a parking rule. They had crossed a line, literally and legally. I remember leaning back in my chair and just shaking my head because the confidence they had shown on that phone call suddenly looked very different. They weren't powerful because they were right. They were powerful because nobody had challenged them yet. And that happens sometimes. People get used to being obeyed. Organizations get used to nobody asking questions. I decided I wasn't going to argue with them emotionally. I was going to do something much more uncomfortable for them. I was going to document everything. I grabbed my camera and walked outside. I took pictures of the boot on my truck, the gravel area, the wooden marker, the edge of the paved road, and every detail that showed where my property ended and theirs began. I photographed the small differences most people would ignore, like the transition between the asphalt and the gravel, the old survey markers near the corner of the lot, even the strip of Bermuda grass that had grown along the dividing line for decades. It felt a little ridiculous at first, walking around my own yard taking pictures like I was investigating a crime scene. But I knew one thing: memories and arguments don't win disputes. Evidence does. Later that afternoon, I called the county planning office. I wasn't expecting much. I figured I would get transferred around, maybe wait on hold, maybe talk to someone who would tell me it was a neighborhood issue. Instead, I reached a zoning specialist named Evelyn Carter who actually took the time to look at the records with me. I explained everything. And after checking the maps, there was a long pause on the phone. Then she said something I will never forget. "Mr. Hayes, according to the county records, the HOA enforcement area stops at the paved road. The gravel section you're describing is outside their jurisdiction." I just sat there quietly for a second because hearing someone official confirm what I already suspected felt different. It wasn't just my opinion anymore. It was documented. I thanked her and hung up, but I didn't immediately celebrate, because by then, I understood this wasn't going to end with a simple phone call. The kind of people who put a boot on someone's truck usually don't back down because a homeowner politely asks them to. So I did what I should have done from the beginning. I stopped treating it like a neighborhood disagreement and started treating it like a legal issue. I filed a civil complaint against Sentinel Shield Services and Pine Ridge Estates for unauthorized immobilization of my vehicle and interference with my property rights. I wasn't trying to destroy anyone. I wasn't trying to embarrass the HOA board. I simply wanted them to acknowledge that they had made a mistake and fix it. When the paperwork was delivered, their entire attitude changed. A few days later, I received a call from the manager of Sentinel Shield Services. This time, the confident tone was gone. He sounded irritated, almost offended that someone like me had dared to challenge them. "You really want to take this further?" he asked. I told him. "I already did," he said. "You're making a mistake. This could have been handled differently." I remember looking out the window at my truck, still sitting there with that ridiculous yellow boot attached to it, and I smiled a little. Not because the situation was funny, but because I finally understood something. They were still talking as if they were doing me a favor. They still hadn't accepted the basic fact that they were wrong. So I said, "The mistake was touching my truck in the first place." There was silence on the phone. The kind of silence where someone realizes the conversation is no longer going the way they expected. After that, things moved faster. Their attorneys reviewed the documents. They reviewed the survey. They reviewed the county confirmation. And suddenly, the same company that had acted like they controlled the neighborhood was now trying to figure out how to quietly walk away. The hearing date got closer, and I started preparing everything. I organized the timeline, printed every photo, saved every message, and created a folder that basically told the entire story from beginning to end. My neighbor Mark, who lived 2 houses down, even stopped by one evening after seeing all the paperwork on my porch. He shook his head and said, "I always wondered if they actually had the authority they claimed to have." I told him, "A lot of people wonder the same thing. They just don't want the headache of finding out." And that was the bigger problem. It wasn't just about my truck anymore. Other homeowners had stories too. People who paid fees because they were afraid to argue. People who accepted warnings because they assumed the HOA must know the rules better than they did. But in this case, the paperwork told a different story. The authority they claimed was never actually theirs. 2 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, I got the call I had been waiting for. Their attorney wanted to resolve the matter, and when I heard what they were offering, I realized this wasn't just about removing a boot from a tire anymore. It was about making sure everyone understood that property rights don't disappear just because someone wears a badge, carries a clipboard, or has a contract with a neighborhood association. The yellow boot that was supposed to make me pay $275 had become the exact thing that exposed everything they had been doing wrong, and the next conversation would decide whether they simply paid me back or whether their entire enforcement operation would collapse. When the settlement papers finally arrived, I remember sitting at my kitchen table again, in the exact same spot where this whole mess had started, and it was almost strange looking back at how different that moment felt compared to a few weeks earlier. The first time I sat there, I was frustrated, confused, and honestly a little angry, staring at old property records and wondering how someone could walk onto my land, lock my truck, and act like they had every right to do it. But now, those same papers were sitting in front of me as proof that the truth had finally caught up with them. Sentinel Shield Services agreed to refund the $275 release fee they demanded, cover the damages caused by their actions, and pay me $1,200 to settle the matter. But the money was never the thing I cared about most. If it had been about the money, I probably would have handled everything differently. I could have paid the fee, complained for a few days, and moved on with my life. Honestly, that would have been the easier choice. The thing that bothered me was the idea that someone could make a decision about my property without taking the time to know whether they actually had the authority to do it. They weren't asking questions. They weren't checking records. They were simply assuming they were right because nobody had stopped them before. And that is a dangerous thing, because when people get used to being obeyed, they sometimes forget they still have to answer to the rules themselves. The biggest change came when Pine Ridge Estates decided to end their contract with Sentinel Shield Services. The same company that had driven through the neighborhood looking for violations suddenly wasn't there anymore. The patrol vehicle disappeared. The yellow boots disappeared. The aggressive notices disappeared. The neighborhood felt different almost immediately, like everyone had been holding their breath without realizing it. A few days later, I walked outside and found a letter from the HOA board in my mailbox. It wasn't the kind of letter I was used to seeing from them, filled with official language and warnings. This one was different. It was an apology. They acknowledged that the enforcement action against my truck had gone too far, and that changes had been made to prevent something similar from happening again. I stood there for a while reading that letter, then looked over at my Tacoma sitting in the same gravel spot where it had always been parked, and I actually laughed a little. Not because the situation was funny, but because the entire battle had been over something that had never changed. The driveway was the same. The property markers were the same. The survey was the same. My deed was the same. The only thing that changed was that someone finally decided to look at the facts instead of just repeating what they wanted to believe. And that was the biggest lesson I took from all of this. Sometimes people don't have real power. Sometimes they only have the appearance of power because nobody has challenged them. They have the title, the office, the paperwork, the confidence. And after a while, everyone around them starts assuming they must be right. But confidence isn't proof. A contract isn't unlimited authority. And a person carrying a clipboard doesn't automatically own the ground they're standing on. I don't want people to think I believe every HOA is bad, because I don't. A good HOA can serve a purpose. Communities need organization. Neighbors need reasonable expectations. Rules can help protect everyone's investment when they are created and enforced fairly. The problem starts when an organization forgets that it exists to serve the homeowners, not control them. There is a big difference between maintaining a neighborhood and treating homeowners like they have no voice. After everything was finished, My neighbor Daniel stopped by one afternoon while I was working in the yard. He looked over at the spot where the boot had been and shook his head. He said, "You know what's crazy? A lot of people would have just paid." And he was right. That was probably the hardest part to accept. Many people don't challenge things because they don't want the stress. They don't want arguments with neighbors. They don't want legal bills. They don't want to become the person everyone talks about at the next community meeting. So, they pay the fine, accept the warning, and tell themselves it isn't worth fighting over. But sometimes a small issue is really a bigger question hiding underneath. Sometimes the $275 isn't the point. The point is whether someone can take something from you simply because they expect you not to question them. That was why I kept going. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted to embarrass anyone. I just wanted the facts to matter. And after everything was over, something unexpected happened. More neighbors started asking questions. They weren't angry. They were curious. They wanted to know where their own property lines were. They wanted to understand what belonged to them and what actually belonged to the HOA. People started looking through their own documents, checking old surveys, and paying attention to details they had ignored for years. And maybe that was the real victory. A yellow boot placed on my truck ended up reminding an entire neighborhood that ownership means something. Records matter, and nobody should be afraid to ask for proof when someone claims authority over their property. So now I want to hear what you think. If you were standing in my driveway that morning and found a boot on your vehicle, would you have fought back? Or would you have paid the fee just to avoid the headache? Do you think HOAs sometimes cross the line because homeowners are too afraid to challenge them? Or do you think strong enforcement is necessary even when mistakes happen? Leave your opinion in the comments, because this is one of those situations where the answer isn't always black and white, and I want to know how you see it. If you enjoyed this story, share it with someone who believes facts, fairness, and property rights still matter. And subscribe for more real stories about ordinary people who stood their ground when someone thought they wouldn't.